So I'm really excited to be here because I've long thought, writing about education, I've sort of fantasized about, well, if we could just like colonize Mars or something, and we had to build schools and colleges, wouldn't that be awesome? Because we would do things totally differently.
We hope. right. We hope we would do
I'm hoping that would, you're right, it's a good point. And you kind of did this, like you, and we're going to get into how this went down, but basically, Paul Quinn College was started shortly after the Civil War, right? 1872, by African-American circuit preachers who were helping to teach former slaves. But when you got there 10 years ago as president, almost 10 years to the day, I believe, it was struggling mightily, and we'll talk about that. So you really had to start from scratch and rethink basic assumptions that our universities make. The reason this is so important, and I just want to share one statistic before I ask you to get into that, because I think it encapsulates so much about what has led to the rising inequality in the United States. In the past 50 years ago, if you looked at 24-year-olds from affluent families in America, 40% of them had bachelor's degrees. That number is now at 73%. It's a great time to be a rich kid in America. If you look at 24-year-olds from low-income families 50 years ago, that number has gone from 6% having bachelor's degrees to 8%. So this system's broken. I'm just going to say it. Like everywhere I go, people are like, yes, I know we have problems with our K through 12 schools in America, but our education system is the finest in the land. And I am here to tell you, it is not. So it's broken. We need to start over. We need to rethink basic assumptions. Tell us, Michael, what you found when you first arrived at Paul Quinn.
Right. So when I arrived at Paul Quinn, we were a broken institution. And that's not anything other than the facts, right? I mean, by any measure that you use, Boston Consulting Group had come out roughly about 6 months before I got in there and done a study on the institution. And they determined that if significant changes weren't made, that the school would go out of business in a year and a half, that the path it was on, the model it was using, was not sustainable. So there was no other path forward, because you don't want an institution that at that point in time was 135 years old to simply cease to exist because we were bad caretakers. So we had 15 abandoned buildings. The entire front of the campus were abandoned buildings. Everyone was unhappy. The students were unhappy. The faculty and staff were unhappy. The board was unhappy. The alums were unhappy. And it was an institution that, you know, ironically, even in those desolate times, still managed to produce some roses growing from the concrete, but those roses were succeeding in spite of, instead of because of.
And you were about to lose your accreditation, right? You did lose your accreditation.
Well, we didn't lose the accreditation, but we had a dogfight of epic proportions.
Okay.
Yes.
Right after you got there? Or?
Yeah, well, no, so I inherited the accreditation situation. I mean, listen, it is the worst possible sales pitch for how you take a new job, right? I mean, you know, people say, listen, we know you've never worked in higher education before. We don't have any money. We're struggling on every count. And we can't pay you what you were making. This is, right? I mean, so one could argue I need career counselors, right?
Right, and I should say that you were a successful lawyer in Dallas before this. I mean, you know, that's what you were doing and hadn't worked in higher ed before, but you were on the board of the college.
I was on the board. I was a very unhappy board member. Yes.
Like most board members.
Like most board members.
Okay.
Except for now. Now my board members are happy.
Oh, sure. I'm all the time, yeah. So what did you do? I'm sure some things you tried to do didn't work. There was probably all kinds of epic struggle, dogfights, to use your phrase. What were some of the things that you did that really did have impact when you look back on it, that mattered most to turn this place around?
Yeah, well, I did a lot of praying.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, you know, not to be flippant about it, but
yeah.
Sometimes you just have to drop on your knees and ask for help, right? But from there, I was honest, right? I said, we aren't very good. This is broken. And we're going to start performing as if we love this institution. And if you love institutions, you reach in, you step outside of yourself, you reconnect to your values, and you do better, right? Now, if you don't want to do better, that's okay, right? There are lots of other places where you can go do you, right? But if you're going to be here, you're going to do us.
Okay.
And so our institutional ethos became we over me. The needs of a community supersede the wants of an individual. And because we think that's important to establish a tone, we are not going to be selfish. We had to make very difficult financial choices, and we had to have some tough conversations. But what I have discovered in my life is people are okay with tough decisions, and they're okay with tough conversations if they actually are leading someplace positive, right? It can't just be tough for the sake of being tough, all right? It's got to be tough with a vision. And we had a vision. We were going to become one of America's great small colleges. We were going to be responsive to the student needs, and we were going to turn ourselves outward and address the issues of the communities we serve. So the first thing we did on my second day, we cut the football program.
That was your second day?
That was the second day.
Okay, so let's just pause. You're in Texas, we should say.
Right.
You are a former college athlete from Chicago.
From Chicago.
How did this happen? How did this happen? Like you saw the football field, like you did the math, what happened?
So the Boston Consulting Group had pointed out, in a very gingerly manner, you might want to cut football, right? You might want to think about this because you can't afford it. I mean, we were spending anywhere from $600 to $800 to $1 million a year in money that we just didn't have. We lost a lot, right? Some might say every game. And it was, there were good people there, but it just didn't work. So, we cut the football program. And, there were some people who were upset. But, there were some students who were upset, but it helps. I'm not a little guy. Right.
Yeah, so you had credibility.
Which is part of the problem.
It's not like me. You're not like, cut the football team. Right? It makes a difference. It makes a difference.
Right. It's a different conversation.
Totally different.
Right, it's a different conversation. But it didn't make sense for us, right? So we terminated the football program. Then next up, we created a dress code. And the dress code was important for several different reasons. One, there was an aesthetic that we needed to have to be more appealing, right? Now, people may not like that, but the reality of it is we treat donors as if they are investors. They are investing in our students. They are investing in the vision of the institution. They're investing in the promise of a better day. So you have to be investment worthy. Now, we can debate it. We can be mad about it, but it is what it is. And so we needed our students to have a competitive advantage, but I inherited an audit that had over 30 findings, all right? So it was a really bad audit. And no one was gonna give us money, but they would give us clothes, right? So we had a gently used clothing drive. And the clothing drive allowed me to go into places and talk about the new vision for the institution. People liked it. They trust you with their secondhand clothes, right? So they would donate the clothes. We would capture all the data because now you're a donor, right? Smart. And depending upon the kind of clothes you donated, that's how we determine donor capacity, right? So if you donated a Versace outfit or a St. John's outfit, you got a call from me, right? If you donated something a little lower on the price scale, you got a really nice thank you note for the rest of the staff, right? Like so. We just, we had to be creative.
Is this a little unfair though? Because if you walk into Stanford classes right now, those kids are wearing pajamas. So you're holding your students to a higher standard. You're kind of asking more of them.
Well, I'm asking more of them because their families are asking more of me, right? If you are the president of Stanford, they just want you to hold up the promise that their children will become millionaires, right? And by and large, most of those Stanford students are coming from economic backgrounds where they're going to be okay, right? I mean, Stanford students, you have to aggressively work to mess them up, okay? They're going to be okay. My students, the communities that we serve, 80 to 85% of my students are Pell Grant eligible. 70% of my students have zero expected family contributions. Their families are giving me and giving my staff their single most prized possession. They are saying this is a contract for our tomorrow. right? And if you do that, then we have to take that more seriously. It's not to say we don't respect Stanford, but it's a different vision. And so we have to do more. We have to prepare you for academic success. We have to prepare you for personal success. We have to instill in you a resilience and a grit that others would not recognize, right? But if you have survived to the point from those circumstances, I would argue you are the model for grit, okay?
And it's something to think about for those of you who are thinking about alumni donations to your own institutions. There's a lot being asked of these students that is not being asked of students and other more affluent students. So you're doing a lot more with a lot less.
So people should give to us.
That's what I'm trying to say. I'm not allowed to say that. Thank you. Tell us about the farm. We got to get this. We got to talk about the farm.
Sure. So we in fall of 2009, which was really the nadir of the moment at the institution, right? We were down to 150 students. There was no, I mean, it was about as on the fence as it could be, right? And we needed a break, right? I mean, like, we were doing all the right things, but we needed someone to step in and say, I believe in you. And this is where prayer comes in handy. So I come back to the office one day after lunch, and I'm in a really bad mood because I've gotten more bad news. And my assistant said, hey, you got a call from Trammell Crow. And I didn't know Trammell Crow. So I thought it was a prank call, right? I thought it was one of my friends being a jerk.
You want to explain who that is?
Some of my friends are jerks, right? And Trammell Crow is the son of the real estate magnate, Trammell Crow, the company that does developments all over the world. And I called him back, expecting it to be one of my friends saying, haha, I got you. And very clearly, it was not one of my friends, right? He said, I'd like to go to lunch. Sure, so we went to lunch. And at lunch, we sort of hit it off because he's really a fascinating guy. And he's talking, and I had been to dinner a few weeks earlier with Gerald Turner, who's the president of SMU in Dallas, who's a phenomenal fundraiser. And I asked him for some advice. He said, just whenever you're with people with means, ask them for something. Right? He says, just get them in the habit of thinking that they need to support you. Okay. So this was my first time to try that new philosophy. Yeah. So I'm sitting there and I was like, the people in our neighborhood, they need a grocery store because we were in a food desert. We were closer to the city garbage dump than we were a grocery store, right? And, I said, you really need a grocery store. People shouldn't live in food deserts, blah, 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 blah. And so without missing a beat, Trammell says, I'm really fascinated by community gardens. And I think community gardens have a significant way of, maybe transforming communities. So, I'm not a dumb guy, right? I recognize that was him telling me you're not getting a grocery store, right? So, I adapt. And I said, I've recently become fascinated by community gardens myself.
So fascinating.
So fascinated, right? Like, key is recently, right? So Trammell says, well, do you have space on the campus for a community garden? I said, well, we do. We can use the old football field, right? Which, he loved. Right. So we're putting this community garden there, and Trammell tells some folks from Pepsi. And the folks from Pepsi come down and they say, hey, this is fascinating. I said, what we should do? We should turn the whole football field into a farm. And the critical piece here is the two folks, Matt and Amy from Pepsi, who came down. Neither of them were college football players, right? Okay. So they were counterculture. They were like, yes, we like this idea. And they said, well, do you have anyone who can run a farm? Do you have any agriculture programs? It was just a small problem, right? I was like, I'll be right back, okay? So
recently, I've met this gentleman.
Right. So I go out to my assistant's desk and I call a staff member. And I said, hey, Elizabeth, you majored in economics at Spelman, right? And she said, I did. There you go. My wife went to Spelman, so Spelman love, okay? So I said, great, you're going to run the farm. And
makes sense.
And she says, I don't know anything about running a farm. I was like, I don't care about that. Google it, right? Like, just figure it out, okay? And that is literally how the farm started, right? She Googled what grows in Dallas. So that's how we started. And it should have never worked, right? I mean, let me be very clear. This should have never worked. That's how we wound up with the farm with no irrigation system at first. We were out there with hoses, sort of like, crops were growing like this. But never underestimate the value of righteous rage, right? People should not, in this day and age, live in food deserts. You should not be in cities of wealth that have the ability to do something, that choose not to do something, right? So we did not allow our inexperience to intimidate us. We're like, if we're going to fail by doing the things that matter for the people who matter to us, right? And at the end of the day, as ridiculous as it seems, it is an overwhelming success now. We have over 2 acres of an organic farm. We have a 3,000 square foot greenhouse. We give away 10% of everything we grow to people in the community. Our largest customer are the Dallas Cowboys. Hell, we've sent more kale to the NFL than we ever did football players, right? So.
Do we have 4 more hours? This is so fun. So I just want to point out that by far the most expensive per student sport in America is tackle football. It's true in high school, it's true in middle school, it's true in college. But if you so much as mention cutting it, it can be just toxic, just deadly. And I know this because it's happened to me. So it is a really hard thing. But most countries in the world, football is not part of your education. It's not an entitlement for students. So it is important to ask these big disruptive questions and to prove out that it is possible. Now, it takes time, it takes guts, it takes effort, it takes prayer, but it is possible to kind of just turn upside down our assumptions about what college is for. And one of the things we know, right, about the pace of change in the world, climate change, economic change, technological change, is that the only way to manage this with any dignity is to change and adapt quickly, right? So when you're in the conversation with the rich guy who says he likes community gardens, so this is a great example, right, of the agility of small institutions or gutsy leaders, because I don't know another way that governments and families and churches and schools are going to adapt to the pace of change because it's not slowing down. So it's a great example. I want to ask you a little bit about what's happening with the student outcomes. So graduation rate started out, 6-year graduation rate when you came in was where?
Roughly 1%.
1%,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and you have to work really hard to have a 1% graduation.
So realizing these numbers are in motion because 6 years, it was 4 years ago that those students, how are we doing?
So we don't measure graduation rates yet, right? Because we tanked our graduation rate. When I came in, we went from 550 students to 150 students in 2.5 years. When you make that decision, you are saying we're playing the long game. Okay, we're not going to cheat the edges. We're going to deal with this substantively, right? So there's no way for you to win that, right? What we did was we said, let's focus on our retention rate.
Okay.
Because if we focus on our retention rates, that's not a lagging indicator. That doesn't measure who we were. That measures who we are, all right? Our retention rate is up to 70%. Right, so 70% of the students who start one fall come back the next fall.
And what was it at when you started?
30,
okay.
33, 34.
Okay,
I mean,
great.
like they weren't strong retention rates, right? And so that gives us a sense of where we are. But part of what's helped our retention rates is our new urban college model, right? So we're the first urban work college in the country. So our students, if you live on campus, you work between 10 to 20 hours a week. And that allowed us to cut tuition and fees by about $10,000, right?
Okay, so you cut tuition and fees by $10,000.
Yes.
This is not a popular thing for colleges to do, right? This is not, there's probably
It was a popular thing for my college.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and part of that you did with this work program. So
Right.
tell me about, now I'm confused because like 3/4 of college students work already.
Yeah, so
it's not like
working.
a new concept. What is it that is different?
Sure, it is an acknowledgement first and foremost that 75% of today's college students are working.
Okay,
Right?
so you're accepting that.
Let's just stop pretending that college is for someone that doesn't exist right now, right? 26% of college students in America have families. 75% of them are working, right? Over half of our students coming through K through 12 now in public schools are living below the poverty level. So it's a different climate now. So let's acknowledge that and start educating the students that are coming to us. When your students, 85% are Pell Grant eligible, those families have a long-term and dysfunctional relationship with work. They've either had long-term unemployment or long-term underemployment. So you've got to address this. Over 50% of students wish colleges had helped them be more prepared for the workforce. Over 75% of employers wish that their students or expect their students to have actual workforce professional skills when they show up. So what we did was we acknowledged that and we said, okay, let's embrace the work college program that have been used typically at rural institutions, but let's apply it in an urban environment. So let's give our students work assignments so that they go to school and they work to 10 to 20 hours per week. That additional work gives us more engagement points with the students. So in addition to whoever else would normally be involved with you, now you've got the dean of the work program, the assistant dean of the work program, your work supervisors. So it's like 3 extra retention counselors right away.
And the students get some of the money, and then the other money goes to the tuition.
The students get some of the money. $5,000 is a work tuition credit, so we use that. I mean, our system allows students to graduate with $9,200 of debt instead of anything more than that, because
so if you graduate in 4 years, you should be able to do it with $9,200.
You're under $10,000, okay. Right? So our students, no, thank you. So our students graduate with 2 educations, right? They have a work college transcript, which details the skills that they've acquired during their 4 years of working. They have the academic transcript, which tells you their intellectual development, right? We don't worry about students finding jobs because they've always had their jobs, right? So they're going to be employed. They don't have large debt, right? Because we want to keep the debt down. So now they have a chance to have lives that they've dreamed of. Mm-hmm. And we've held up our promise and our contract with their families to leave these students and their family lineages better than we found them.
One of the questions that always comes to mind when we hear really inspiring stories like this is, okay, but is it replicable? Like, can more places do this? You know, do you feel like this is something that only small colleges could do, and only small colleges with like a, super persistent, slightly crazy leader, or is it like
did you just
that's a small
on
number?
The low call me crazy, right? You're a nut job,
well,
right?
You can't, it's not everybody who's going to take those risks. So do you feel like it's replicable?
Absolutely. I designed the model and I designed it to be replicable, right? Because I expected people to question it and to want to discount it, because people don't tend to believe things they've never seen before, and they damn sure don't believe them coming from places they've never thought about before, right? So if I were at Stanford and I did this, I'd be the Secretary of Education, right? But because we're doing it in, quote unquote, the shadows, it's a little harder to get people to buy into. But here's the reality. Students are already working. You can incorporate the students working into your academic profile, right? It requires your faculty to be supportive, to accept that there's going to be a shift. It requires people to actually engage a little bit more hands-on. But especially if you're in an urban environment, there are all these employers, so you have that opportunity.
Right.
It is absolutely capable of being replicated, and I am happy to come visit anyone and teach them how to do it.
One of the things you mentioned is having all these support systems and having the Dean of Work, is that what it's called, Dean of Work program? I think that's something you hear again and again. Daniel Greenstein at the Gates Foundation talks about what matters with helping students finish college is putting your arms around them. Like, it's the reintroduction of intimacy is what he says.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It's not just about the money, and it's not just about the credits, and I guess small colleges are particularly well positioned potentially to do that. But do you think it's something that you can, like some colleges like Arizona State have experimented with, like, student coaches and success coaches, and some of it's you get automated text messages, and I mean, do you think that's replicable at a large scale university, intimacy?
So here's what I think. I think you have the 2 most exciting models in higher education is the Arizona State model, which is perfect for large state institutions, and our model, which is perfect for the smaller. I don't think you have to apply ours to there, although you certainly can use a lot of what we're doing there. But I think we've given people parallel pathways to delivering on the promise to students at a much higher level. And the other thing that I would add that might have something to do with our nurturing environment, we have an awful lot of women in leadership positions. And I think that adds to it. Yeah, no, but I think that adds to it.
Before we go, we've got 30 seconds left. You mentioned that you could be the Secretary of Education. Is that a job that you want? Like, is that?
I don't think it's available to me.
Speaking of the Trump administration, I have to end on this question. So, you were not at the recent White House meeting of HBCU leaders, but you were at a meeting shortly after that with a bipartisan congressional
the
group
next day.
The next day. What is it that you need from the federal government to amplify and succeed at what you're doing?
Yeah, well, the first thing we need the federal government to do is to acknowledge where the students are coming from, okay? Over 50% of the students coming through the public school systems in this country, charter schools or public schools, live in poverty-stricken communities. They are below the poverty level. That is what the Access Agenda is meant to support. That is what FSEOG is for. That is what the Pell Grant is for. That's what the TRIO programs are for. That's what the after-school programs are for.
So you're saying don't take those away.
You should not take away the programs that are working and are dedicated to helping lift those who we often consider to be the least of us. I would argue they might very well be the most of us, right? To lift them into the places that give them the security that they deserve. Listen, we are making a choice, all right? When you aspire to deregulate everything, you are still making a choice. You are still benefiting someone. All I'm saying is that the time has come for us to look around, recognize we need year-round Pell. We need these programs that give people a competitive opportunity. It's not even a competitive advantage because you're still in a classroom with people who have far more than you have. And let's not forget about that. Like, America doesn't have to stand for just a wealthy few, right? That's not who we are. It's not who we have to be. And a tyranny of the minority should never rule the majority, right?
So what do you tell people in the room or who are watching who feel like, man, that's all true, but that's not the way we're headed, like who feel discouraged and hopeless?
Well, I would tell them that 10 years ago, I took over a school with a 1% graduation rate that had, 30 days of cash on hand that everyone had given up upon. And 10 years later, from rolling up our sleeves, dreaming a different dream, being willing to be a contrarian voice in the room, fighting like hell, praying, I'm sitting on a stage with you at the Aspen Institute and talking about leadership principles in higher education.
Amen. Thank you so much for being here. Good luck.
Thank you, and I want to say I love your book.
Thank you.
Right.